To the reality show. Today I've got Marco and Richard and Alejandro with me. How's it going, guys?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Lovely. So the main topic we're going to be talking about today are some proposed new laws which are going to be brought in by the British government, some which have been proposed by the actual government and some which have been proposed by a former member of the government, kind of shouting from the outside. So we'll start with the proposed ones actually, because they're in a sense more radical. So this is coming from Suella Braverman, who was sort of spectacularly sacked a few months ago, and she was the former Home Secretary, or did she resign? I actually can't remember, but she was the former Home Secretary who had to leave office after controversy surrounding marches through London to do with Israel and Palestine. She rhetorically was very harsh on these marches and sort of had to leave after she published a news article which was unapproved by the government, which was very critical of how the police had been handling them. And this current article that we're sort of looking at today is one that she's published ahead of sort of preempting the government again, because the government is announcing further powers for the police to be able to take action against some of these marches. And she's actually proposed some more radical steps than the government actually have. So Marco and Richard, what did you guys make of the situation of Suella Braverman's proposals and so on?
Yeah, this is an eventful day because I agree with the government stance on this one. I kind of like Suella Braverman and I kind of admire her for stepping away from the government, for effectively not being very sticking to the promises, if you like, that they made. However, on this occasion, I prefer the Conservative government's outlook on this, where they stop short of giving the politicians the discretion to choose when a protest should go ahead or not. At the moment, the police can stop a protest if they suspect that's going to lead to chaos or criminality or violence. While Suella Braverman is actually suggesting to give the Secretary of State, i.e. the Home Office, what's the equivalent in the United States?
The Homeland Security,
Homeland Security, or whatever, yeah. The discretion to decide whether a march should go ahead or not. And I think giving more power to a government is always a mistake. The whole idea is the government should be there to protect individual rights and just do that job and do it well. Now, the police already have numerous powers which they can fall on in order to pick up criminals. The problem is they're not doing this. So if they just enforce the legislation that is there at the moment, we will be all right. But they choose not to do that. And the solution is not more legislation, it's more enforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure in this episode we're going to get deep into the principles and the values behind all this. But just to nail the stuff related to the UK, just to make it clear without getting parochial about it. What Suella Braverman, the previous holder of the post, is proposing is four things. She's proposing the one that Marco mentioned there, power for the Home Secretary, more powers to stop specific chants on marches, prescribing terrorism groups, more powers for that, and again supporting terrorism groups. Some of those are a little bit hard to discern exactly what she means, and that perhaps is part of the problem. On the government side, what they're doing is they're more concrete examples. They're very specific examples. They're about not wearing masks on marches. They're about not using fireworks and flares on marches. And there's a lot to do with climbing on war memorials and disrespecting war memorials during protests. So they've gone for the very specific, obviously missing a lot of the principles and values that we're undoubtedly going to discuss.
Yes. And so, Alejandro, what did you also think about this?
Well, I think I agree with Mark and Richard that this law doesn't look at all right. And I think I'm a bit more opposed to it, to the law than Mark and Richard. We'll discuss about that later. But in essence, a way to interpret the law is, well, I don't like this kind of protest, so we will try to make it a law to prohibit them to some extent. And I think that's really bad, and it reveals the incapacity and lack of determination from the conservatives and how unprincipled they are. And in essence, the law says, well, I don't like that they state this kind of they make this kind of statement, so we will ban the river to the sea chant. But okay, and maybe if they resort to some euphemism of that, we will also ban it as well. So it's like whack-a-moling your way down to the protest, rather than tackling what should be the real issue. And as Marco very well mentioned, the real issue is not the thing that they are saying, which to me it's terrible in itself, and I think it should have a moral blame on the people who go and protest in favor of Hamas, but rather the form. And there are enough laws that already ban the bad things that happen or the terrible things that happen in the protest. You shouldn't take over private property or government property. You shouldn't be exerting any kind of violence upon people. But those laws already exist. And the main issue and the main problem over here is that you have conflicting notions placed upon policemen, which essentially make it impossible for them to be a real and objective arbiter. Well, because on the one hand, you say to them, hey, please allow people to protest freely. And on the other one, you say, hey, please allow people to transit freely. And if you see the conflict over there is you have two opposing views and two opposing things that will conflict in an instant. And that's why you see protesters, not only with the Palestinian protests, but also in other kind of scenarios where you see police protecting protesters who are about to make someone not go to the hospital because someone is really ill. Protesters stopping ambulances as well. And that's not because the police is siding on one because of their ideology, but because they have conflicting views as well. And this bill won't solve that.
Yeah. I feel pretty mixed about the police in this case, which is maybe the more minor aspect of it, because they do have a genuinely, I think, difficult job in dealing with these protests. And I can understand in the sense that they would probably be giving the feedback to the Home Secretary that we need to be able to do more about this. But then at the same time, those examples that you mentioned, Alejandro, also came to mind where there were protests of people blocking the road and the police behaved disgracefully, really, in sort of really kind of being very nice to these people and helping them instead of doing what they should have done, which is remove them from the road. I think it's the whole debate around the marches that goes on in the mainstream kind of consciousness of the UK, I think, is very disappointing in the sense that you have Suella Braverman on the one hand, who's viewed as the symbol of people who think there's something wrong with these marches. And then you have everyone else who thinks that she's just crazy for calling them hate marches, for example. And calling them hate marches is completely innocuous. And it's very disappointing that people view that as a problem, or that, and so you hear her being criticized as being kind of a loony, and how could you ever say that these are hate marches, because these are people who are marching in favor of a ceasefire, no matter how many sort of anti-Semitic things are actually said on these marches, right? But Suella Braverman I view as quite an unsavory figure in lots of ways, and quite an unprincipled figure. She's sort of appealing in a sense to the kind of conservative base, which is feeling very emotionally strong against this, and that's kind of good in a way. But also she'll trample over any kind of principle in order to get what she wants. And what was interesting when she tweeted this article out that she's published in the Telegraph, looking at the responses to it, they were very sharply divided, almost 50-50. People who were saying, too right and you should go further, and people calling her kind of a lunatic. But no one was kind of saying isn't there a principle at stake here, or something like that? And so I think she's, in a sense, just kind of engaging in the confusion that exists in a lot of our culture around this. And one of the key things that keeps popping up in the discussion is this idea of extremism, which of course Rand spoke about at length as an anti-concept. I think in a whole article which is called Extremism, the Art of Smearing, I think, which everyone should go check out. But Marco, so, I mean, you said you had some things that you liked about Suella Braverman. Do you want to talk a bit about her in this?
Well, when I say I like one of the current politicians, it's always comparatively.
Sure.
I prefer her to, the existing Home Secretary, for example. I like a stance or Brexit, all this kind of stuff, but that's as far as it goes, really. I like it up to a point. But as you were saying, I think the essential thing here is the kind of confusion you were talking about among people. The same people who call for ceasefire are actually calling jihad, and they're calling it a struggle. But and all this kind of use of terms to suit a certain narrative, like genocide applied to putting down a dog, that's genocide. Doing anything that people don't like nowadays has become genocide. And all these terms are always designed to hide what the real problem is. These marches are hate marches because, again, calling for a ceasefire in the current conflict, Israel versus Hamas, is effectively giving Hamas carte blanche to redo the event of October 7th over and over and over again. So all these herds of overeducated, out of civilization people who are calling for stop the war, we want to ceasefire, they're effectively asking for the end of Israel. And people who understand that are leveraging their do-gooders' intentions in order to push their agenda, which is one of hate, one of spreading hateful ideas, supporting Arab people from Gaza, and by even collecting money with the excuse of stopping the war. And all this kind of stuff is creating a massive rift in our society. And it's also exposing what kind of bully techniques these guys are using, because we're not talking about protests most of the time. We're talking about disruption, willful disruption. So I want to have the right to go in central London on a weekend without being interrupted or stopped by these buffoons. And the police should be there to stop them from disrupting most of people's life, rather than taking a picture with a little jihadi kid because he looks cute, ignoring the fact he's dressed like a bloody jihadi. If the police don't apply the legislation they go, and I realize it's a different call for them, but it's a call that can be made, and it's up to them to enforce civilized rules.
I think the responses to what Suella Braverman's proposed, and the fact that it has been so tribal, is an indictment of the society we're in at the moment. It's an indictment of the politics that are at the top of it and the culture that exists within it. I think lots of the responses are essentially ad hominems, or in today's form, they're memes, which seems to be the equivalent of it. And I think that they're largely missing the point. And the point here is about the evasion that has occurred through cowardice for far too long, and the fact that justice hasn't been applied universally. Now, and what justice is based on in the first place. Now, the concern that if you give the Home Secretary new powers to decide which protests go ahead and which don't, and therefore it's going to be unfair in that point, in that scenario, yeah, that's one side of it. But also how you police under existing rules, the existing protests that do occur is already demonstrating that justice isn't universally applied, or there aren't the same rules for the same groups on the same streets. That's a key element that needs to be exposed here. And I think when it comes to the police versus the politicians, there's a lot of buck passing between the two. There's the phrase that the politicians like to use all the time about the police when they don't want to state a position, which is it's a police operational decision, which sometimes it is, but sometimes that's just a way of saying, don't ask me about this group or this principle because I don't want to say, I'm going to stick my neck on the line. And then on the police's side, it's the fact that sometimes they're using it as a political football. Sometimes they're undermined by the politicians who don't support them when they do enforce a law, or they criticize them en masse for the effect of like a handful of bad Apple officers, and then the politicians come straight out and damn the entire force as institutionally racist. And then you've got the politicians on their knees at the next protest, and they're trying to pay penance for previous sins or the sins of other people or the sins of the past. And all of that messes with the justice that should be enforced and who it's enforced by.
Yes, and I guess maybe for listeners who aren't in the UK, the history of policing and protests over the last few years is probably not wholly dissimilar to situations like in the US, which they probably are familiar with, where particularly around lockdowns and afterwards, there were protests held, particularly one that was held for a young woman who was murdered by a police officer whose name I'm forgetting now. I'm terrible for forgetting names, but that was an especially controversial issue because it was a police officer who kidnapped and murdered this young woman. And when there was a kind of vigil stroke protest held in her memory, the police were quite heavy-handed in their response, or at least people viewed them as being heavy-handed. And that's led to a huge controversy. The police commissioner at the time, who's in the sense the head of the police force, eventually had to resign, a lady called Cressida Dick. So there's a whole context over the last few years of, in a sense, increasing pressure on the police force to improve how they behave, but then also, I think, a kind of pressure cooker effect where they want to be able to do more in order to respond. So we kind of have not really, we have an increasingly sort of, I don't know how to put it, but a situation which is getting egged on, in effect. It's getting more and more intense. Alejandro.
Well, it's true. There are no standards by which to tell the police how to behave. And another example is how during the lockdowns, there were protests which were tackled down because of the content that they were having. When the protests were against racism, they were essentially free. But when they were against lockdowns, they were heavily repressed. And I'm not preaching about the content. I think I oppose racism and I oppose the lockdowns as well. The government should not have any say on the type of things that should be banned or not. I think the government only has a say on the kind of attitudes and activities that you do while protesting. In my view, you have no right to close down streets, to oppose the right to transit, and to break down private or government property. And I think maybe to bring another example that is happening right now and that is really interesting, Javier Milei in Argentina, which Argentina is a country that has massive problems of protest. One of the interesting things that he has done is that he has said that anyone has the right to protest as long as they don't obstruct the streets. And so far, mostly this has been respected. There's a chance that it won't, that it will be out of his hands if he loses control or popularity. But so far, it has been decent. And I think there's some chance that that could be applicable to the US or the UK as well. Now, maybe a caveat for that is that Milei is also using face recognition to say anyone that goes to protest and violates the right to transit will lose its right to receive certain benefits if they're unemployed and so on. And I think maybe the issue of the face coverings, that it's also being introduced by by the government could be made on that sense. Although I don't think that they will be as radical as Milei as well.
No, probably not. The government. So the cynical aspect of this story, I guess, if maybe cynical is the right word, is that presumably Suella Braverman knew that the government was going to be announcing these new policies. Presumably one of her old colleagues kind of informed her, and she's very then conveniently preempted them by writing this article, and has made the government's policies look incredibly timorous. So the thing with removing face coverings, the police currently can basically, I think it's under section 60 or something like that, can tell you to remove your face covering, but there's not really a penalty if you don't do it. And the new proposals may mean that they can arrest you if you refuse to obey by that, which is in a sense a meaningful increase in the police powers. It means they can actually enforce that order. But then she's proposing so much more fundamentally radical things. The ability to outright ban a protest, which in a sense the police can already do by refusing it under certain conditions. And one of the things that I didn't see detailed is exactly what it means then to ban the protest. I don't know if that just means it's completely at their discretion and they don't really have to explain why. But one of the things that she reiterated a couple of times is she wants to defend the right to protest, but she thinks that you can't have the right to protest, or the right to protest is superseded in the instance of these marches because they're motivated by bigotry. And I think that was one of the things that I think really stood out as signaling that there's kind of confusion here or something going really wrong, because why would you lose the right to protest because your protest is motivated by kind of poor intentions or by hatred or something like that. And something which I thought was really, which initially made me quite dislike her stance on this, is even though she was calling out these marches for being the terrible kind of thing that they are, she was initially criticizing them under hate speech laws. And to see the conservatives, who typically set themselves up as the kind of the radical people in the culture war who are going to defend free speech and so on, to very opportunistically make use of that legislation, or at least threaten to do that, was immensely disappointing. And I think the fact that she opposed the right to protest off against bigotry showed that there was confusion. And maybe we can talk more about the whole idea of the right to protest. But Marco and Richard.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I really dislike her suggestion to give discretion to a politician in order to decide whether a march should go ahead or not, because we know politicians are born to be pragmatists. So they will decide on a stance, on a political view, or what the people want, and all this kind of stuff. So I certainly don't want that. What was I saying?
I can just pick up on that for a second. I think that the problem on the other side is that policing itself has been politicized. And even within the force and within the ranks and within the ways in which it's dealt with, already there isn't that distinction. So the way that police seem to, as long as you can make a heart signal with your hands and be photographed smiling next to every different sector of society, then you've done your job. And it becomes a cross between being a social worker and being some sort of PR merchant for diversity, which distracts from them enforcing the laws that they should be enforcing.
Yeah, I mean, take for example one of the marches where people have been chanting or showing placards in favor of jihad or Hamas, or even carrying flags from ISIS or whatever. Well, it doesn't take new legislation for a policeman to pick up the person carrying those things and take them out and arrest them. The protests can carry on. They can protest in favor of whatever they want, but every single individual who's caught breaking the law is going to be arrested. And if you enforce the basic rules that already exist, you really don't have to come up with anything new. Again, as Richard said, lately the police has been politicized so badly. And as Alejandro mentioned, during the COVID, we've seen the different treatment between the BLM marches during the COVID lockdown and the people who were protesting against lockdowns. Totally different standards. And you can't expect anything good to come out of this. Because, for example, even focusing on the red herring of the masks. Well, we are in Britain, we're in London. There's a massive Muslim population. Of course, the law will take into account people who wear burqa. So you'll find 100% of the people attending wearing a burqa, whether they're Muslim or not, just to flaunt the ban. It's just ridiculous. If you just try and address the issue du jour, you miss the whole point, you miss the whole principles, and you're gonna keep coming up with legislation for every single instance.
And when you're seeing what these marches with somebody waving a jihadi flag among a large group of people as they're marching along the street, and the police are just watching them or watching them go by or whatever, or they're watching someone deface a war memorial or whatever, and they're not intervening, then one of the points of justice is that it needs to be seen to be done. It doesn't have to just be done. It needs to be seen by people who aren't guilty of it, that other people are being punished for flouting the rules. So, and this argument that the person waving the jihadi flag is different from all of those that surround them, well, that's going to be tested if the police then pull that person and that flag to one side. If the rest of the crowd start to defend that person or intervene or become, accessories to the fact that he's waving the flag and are resisting his arrest for doing so, then they're revealing their true colors at the same time. They're revealing that they do support the waving of the flag and they're just as guilty as the flag waver. However, if they are separate and they don't agree with that flag and they continue to march peacefully, then they're making the distinction clear. But the fear of causing a ruckus, or the fear of offending a group of people, which means that the police simply watch a protest pass and don't pull someone to the side, but hope afterwards through cameras and on the quiet and without raising a big scene and without showing justice to be done, to then go after the person and try and get them afterwards, is, even if that is done, and we don't really know because it happens afterwards, not at the time for everyone to see, it's missing the opportunity, and it's missing the principle of enforcing the law visibly for all.
And this is maybe a slight tangent from me, but I think the issue with policing came out and appeared on a lot of people's radars around the time of COVID. Now, it might have appeared beforehand in the sense of the politicization, when people were very wary about a way that in how police were responding to certain political groups when they were protesting. So Black Lives Matter, for example, have been mentioned, and so on. But in the early days of lockdown, there were, and I assume this must have been a similar situation to a lot of other countries, but I don't know for sure. There was no legislation passed to enable the government to do what it did in effect, or any new powers given to the police. But the government basically said so, and the police acted on it. So there was no new law passed, but the police said you could only go out of your house a certain number of times a day. You have to stay a certain distance away from people, and the police acted on it. And sort of everyone, I guess, was a bit shell-shocked at the beginning, so no one sort of said anything about it. But then one guy who's very eloquent, called Lord Sumption, who used to be a member of the Law Lords, which is a kind of precursor to the Supreme Court. I think he's a historian as well. Wrote quite eloquently about how, in effect, that's an abdication of the rule of law, because this is just the word of politicians. And then retroactively, they ended up doing this. But people sort of, I think, were woken up in that moment to the fact that, oh, there's something really concerning here. Politicians just told us that this was okay, and everyone just went along with it. And so we have to, although it wouldn't just be okay, in my mind, if Parliament had said, yes, we sanction this, there's also something very important, I guess, to policing, with there being a kind of proper and legitimized method to give them the powers that they have. That's just something that came to mind. But so, Alejandro, just any other thoughts? But I wanted to also focus in on this issue of the right to protest, because I think objectivists have a kind of unique perspective on that.
Yes, let me comment first that I think one of the ways in which we can see this reaction from Suella Braverman's side is that evasion is the complete opposite, or mostly the opposite, of the Hydra of Lerna, the monster that you chop, that when you chop one head, another comes out. It's actually the opposite. Whenever you evade an issue or unable to tackle the source of something wrong happening in the culture, what happens is that another evil head comes out. And when actually you cut the head, that is, you go to the source and remove the essential problem, then the monster comes out. And I think these last months have been really tough personally for me to see that so many people in this country, which I really love, have such terrible and like really nihilistic ideas, and that they not only cower or are not very shy about them, but actually they go out to the streets and flaunt them. And I would see why people would be horrified to see that spectacle. I'm horrified. But see what the reaction has been. One is, oh, immigration. Like, we have too many, they don't say these words, but certainly that's the thing that they say. Oh, we have too many Muslims. We have to cut down the refugee status. We have to reduce immigration because there are too many of them, and we want we want less of this kind of reactions. And that's why you've seen all over Europe that immigration has been cut down. But what you're seeing now as well, and maybe this is a longer story than just this pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian issues, is that they're also trying to go and abridge our right to speech, because this is not only about protesting, or it's also about what things you're able to say, hidden as the right to protest. And Morgan, you said very well that objectivism has a very specific and very nuanced position about protest. And in essence, as a student of objectivism, I would say that the position is essentially, there's no right to protest as such. You have a right to say whatever you have in your mind. You have the right to do whatever you say in your private property, but you don't have the right to use the property of someone else to say whatever you want. And what is happening right now is that with the conflagration of these two terms, of the right to protest and the right to free speech, what you're saying is, oh, well, clearly having a free speech isn't working. Let's try to make a list of the kind of things that are improper, and we will start with the most hideous things. But if you know the government, that's going to quickly go to things that are more respectable. And what you're seeing right now is, oh, it's only anyone that supports terrorism is going to be arrested or held by the police. But that's in essence just one kind of speech and one kind of way of supporting things and issuing your thoughts. And if these things continue, it will be natural for the government to closely and quickly abridge our right to free speech.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on, guys. Go.
Sorry, Morgan. On top of it, Morgan, you mentioned earlier on roughly the split to Suella Braverman tweet is 50-50, which is fairly frightening in my view, because 50% of people are quite happy to, again, give up more freedom. We just come out of the stupid policies of lockdown that kept us for a year and a half in prison, in our homes, effectively. And people are still quite happy to go down the route. That's the real frightening people. That's a real frightening thing. People who do not realize that the policy that they go down, the road that they follow, will lead to more and more statism. The state will have more and more power over the individual. That, in my view, is absolutely reprehensible and scary.
I think to your point about how policing is done, and especially with COVID being an example of that, the way that the Britain works is policing by consent, which is very similar to sort of British common sense. They're all such vague terms. They're vague enforcement terms, which means that people go along with it, but you persuade people to go along with it. The police will try and talk you into doing something, persuade you to do it, ask you to take your mask off, repeatedly ask you to take your mask off, make it sound like you have to take your mask off, but in the end, the law is kind of on the side of you can keep your mask on, and if you know these loopholes and these ways of getting around it, it causes all sorts of problems because the law is not clear. For example, I think when it comes to the problem with protests generally is there's all sorts of areas where protests become more than just protests, where they can become forms of mass intimidation, where they can become antagonistic, particularly in the location, for example, whether you're talking like Orange Order marches or marches past synagogues or outside of particular schools or whatever the issue is, that there are certain locations which are particularly heighten the tension in a march. And of course, they're public spaces as well, and you shouldn't be blocking the highway. I think the other aspect I wanted to mention was precedent, and the fact that precedent is not just relevant in terms of law, but it's relevant in terms of how people perceive the law as well, and how it's enforced, because it undermines principle if your last precedent was that the last lot got away with it, or the last lot bent the rules, or the last lot were treated differently because they shouted louder, then the precedent set is that law can be set by your whims, by whether you shout the loudest and you're the strongest mob or the most threatening mob. And of course, that leads to a road that can only end ultimately in anarchy.
Yes. So the way people perceive protests has been a problem for quite a long time. So anyone who's ever walked around a university, particularly sort of a few months into the year, so the academic year has gotten underway, the professors have had time to get a bit annoyed about something, and then they've voted for a strike. What will inevitably happen is the students will storm into some of the buildings, throw a load of banners up, and sit there 24/7 saying that they're there kind of protesting for a cause. And the university will be terrified about throwing them out because of how bad that'll look in terms of PR. And so we'll kind of say that it's okay for them to be doing that, which of course actually takes all the sting out, the idea of it being a protest, but that's neither here nor there. And people are allowed to do this. So, okay, we can sit in this building because we have the right to protest, no matter who owns the building, no matter what, and so on and so forth, right? But then if you think about the difference, so in various places I've worked in my life, if a homeless person or a drug addict comes into the building and sits somewhere that they're not allowed to be, you can call the police and have them removed. And the principal issue isn't the fact that they're one person, whereas the students are many. It's that this person doesn't have the wit to say that they're there protesting in favor of Palestine, right? That's the actual difference. And so the right to protest really, if you were to take it seriously, would mean that you would have the right to protest on any private property, presumably at any time. And the only reason you wouldn't would be the government would have to take a kind of unprincipled, pragmatic kind of perspective of, oh, you have the right up until this point, but then because we have to balance your rights off against other people's, we would have to limit it here, which is essentially arbitrary. And then we end up being led down that road. Just before we go on, guys, let me just do the super chats. So we've got $5 from Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan. $3 from Mary Aline and $3 from Johnny. Thank you very much. Then Chana Etzer gives 6 shekels and says, is the Muslim party the next step? I'm not 100% sure what she's referring to, because there isn't actually is there a Muslim political party in the UK? I don't think there is.
Oh yeah, we might see one soon, I think.
You've already seen some going independent, kind of leaving Labour, for example, setting up independent groups when the issue of the reaction to Labour's rules on Labour's opinion, or the leader of the Labour Party's stance on Palestine. You've seen a few local councillors and stuff resign, set up their own independent parties, and be elected essentially on the basis purely of their religion. And that is a worrying trend, because if you're going to end up with a bunch of religious parties, then you've really got trouble ahead. And that's the problem with how the defense is often presented from the conservative side, is it becomes a sudden waving the flag for Christianity or for those kind of things as a response to a religion they like less. And that's this bending over for religion all the time instead of reason is part of the problem we're facing here. Not only is faith given the same weight as reason, often it's given more protection than reason. You're protecting people who believe whatever they believe over the reasonable and reasoned position of people going about their daily lives and just trying to, shop, work, and live.
Yeah, and as you were saying, we have Britain has a history of protests, peaceful protests, which often achieved social change for the better. But here we're seeing something a bit different. In the last, since probably BLM, really, that's probably a pivotal moment. You start actually seeing protest as a sort of intimidation. It's a bit of a mob of the rule of the mob, who are actually trying to intimidate society into giving in to their demands, whether it's equality, whether it's whatever the cause du jour is. But the main issue is that this is actually taking advantage of how civilizations lack of self-esteem, and how our self-doubt is actually coming through, and these people are taking advantage of it. You see groups like, we're talking about supporters of Hamas, which tend to be Islamist groups. These groups are taking roots here because they can take advantage of the freedom that we have gained throughout the centuries. I mean, we didn't start for a different situation. Our civilization didn't come from a different planet. It took centuries for us to discover the principle behind what makes civilized society, how we live in a civilized society, which is a route that they could choose to take rather than going down the theocracy, dictatorship that they want to spread across the world. And that's part of the issue. They are using our soft spots, our extremism for freedom against us. And we are allowing them to do it because we are too scared to fight back in the name of multiculturalism. We accepted that their culture is as good as ours, which is not, but we can't do anything about it, apparently. And this is where you start allowing ground for the far right that we see coming up in Europe, especially. But if you don't cover the ground against this kind of mob, you will leave room for nasty characters to come in. Already, what Richard said, we start hearing about much more towards religion. My God is better than yours. This kind of crap. And then you certainly hear people talking, oh, our culture is not like that, blah, blah, blah. But our culture is not fixed in stone. So you can still have a culture which is progressing to take into account new things. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be a culture that moves back towards the Middle Ages. It can be a culture that still moves on towards the future, towards more freedom for the individual. And that's why it's a bit sad to hear people like Douglas Murray, who's the guy who's been on the best side intellectually on this last few months on this particular topic. When he talks about, for example, sacred monument and uses kind of language, listen, I don't like to have anything sacred in terms of, in the sense of God-given right to Catholicism or religion or Church of England to have supremacy in England. Supremacy in England should be for freedom. That's why we are the original parliamentary, the idea that eventually went to produce United States.
Yes. And then Mary Eileen gives $2 and says, I very much admire Lord Sumption, brilliant man. Yeah, he's someone that everyone should check out. He's obviously not an objectivist per se, but, well, not at all. But he's very interesting and thoughtful and good to listen to on these topics. And so, we've spoken about how the right to protest isn't really a right, certainly from the objectivist perspective. But you get into this problem where you could plausibly say on the back of that, I guess, or I could imagine someone saying, therefore, the kind of powers which Suella Braverman is wanting are kind of legitimate, in the sense that if these people are going to go and protest on property that's not theirs, the government should be able to go stop them doing that. And that's kind of true, but we get into this problem where our government's so unprincipled that you don't want them being involved in any of this stuff really anyway, because as Mark and Richard have mentioned, you see this kind of arbitrary application of the laws to certain groups. There were certain groups who protested who didn't have very much police presence or didn't have very much opposition to them at all, then maybe they should have done. And there were certain protests where it was very heavy-handed. And so we already know, in effect, that the police will police selectively. And so there's no reason we should have any confidence that they'll use these powers in a just way, even if we were to say that they should be allowed them in the first place.
And that was Suella Braverman's point, and the point that she got fired over, wasn't it? Was making the point that the policing was not balanced. Now, I know she wasn't necessarily the best advocate for that stance, and it allowed all sorts of people afterwards to, when the march took place on Armistice Day, and there were some, supposed far right people trying to protect the cenotaph from other groups that potentially could have desecrated it, that then you end up with a story that's an utter distraction from what is really the case. So, but the point is still relevant, that the policing has been lopsided, and it's been lopsided out of cowardice, evasion, and a lack of application of even justice.
Alejandro?
What I was thinking about right now is that I don't really like Suella Braverman, but for other issues. But in essence, I do think that from what you were saying before, it's true that there is no standard by which one should judge this kind of issues. But it doesn't follow that banning the right or the right to protest would imply that this law is proper. Actually, it doesn't follow, mainly because what this law is giving is the government more power to decide which protest it likes or not. And that's actually the source of the problem. That this right to protest mean is that there are some people who will be favored by the government to close the streets, and so people will not. And this law only consolidates that and only allows for the government to have more arbitrary power to see and to say who goes and what's allowed to be said or not.
Yeah. All roads lead to more statism from both sides, doesn't it? Whether it's one side wanting to police more and define more what hate speech is, or another side wanting to define exactly when and where you can protest and in what form and all the rest of it. So all of it needs to, or we need more laws, more state control. And that's always the red flag for anyone on the objectivist side of things.
Yeah, there's certainly nobody suggesting that the police maybe shouldn't be armed with further and further legislation ad infinitum. So, but we've been saying a lot. So, and just while we're kind of drawing to the end of the show, we've been talking a lot about what's wrong with this and what we wouldn't like to see, which is perfectly legitimate. So let's say more. What would be a good thing from the government on this kind of thing? Like, so what kind of law would you like to see proposed by the government in order to deal with policing? Or if not a law, what would you like to hear them saying in effect? Like, what would be the right thing for them to be doing about these protests, if anything? Mark and Richard, and then we'll come to Alejandro.
Personally, I would like less interfere from politicians in the business of policing. The problem with the police, especially here in London right now, is because they are controlled by the mayor of London, who's a notorious weasel. It's a small man in stature and small man in political stature and intellect. And he's been interfering with the business of policing forcing them, effectively calling them racist, which meant that every single policeman is terrified of being accused of being racist now if they do the job. So reduce the amount of interference from politicians, allow police to investigate, clamp down on real crimes, and everything will follow. If people see that justice is served, that crime is dealt with, crime itself will probably get reduced. So you don't really need to do much more. You have to do less.
For my part, I'd say I think the problem is that the politicians don't have the moral authority to instigate change, almost of any kind at the moment. And it's because they can't lay out clearly their values. Because a lot of the discussion of like the monuments, for example, has been talking a bit about it being anti-British, or it's talking about the tradition, or as Marco mentioned earlier, whether they're sacred or not, without understanding that the monuments represent what people did in the past for the same values that we should be applying today. And you're not applying those values today, so there's no point protecting a lump of stone which supposedly commemorates them in the past. So it's making sure that they can lay out what the values are that the country, the society, the human should be standing for, a human that values life and wants a civilized world to live in, and therefore from that the minimum necessary to ensure the protection of individual rights that allows people to thrive based on their own efforts and their own lives.
Alejandro?
From the government, I would say what would be ideal is the government to say there's no right to protest, to take government or private property and do whatever you like. And actually, in reality, what it should be is that there should be no government property, and therefore any kind of these actions would be an action of private property, of people either using private property properly or not. But for now, and something that could be done relatively easily and maybe with some support of society, would be the notion of the government should be incapable or unable to decide which protest should be permitted or not, which chants should be allowed or not. But the closure of streets and motorways and highways is strictly forbidden. The closure of the traffic is completely forbidden. Any person that is trespassing any private property should be taken away and removed, and any kind of violence should be taken swiftly away. I would say that would ease a lot of the problems related to the arbitrariness that police officers have right now.
Yes, I think that's a good suggestion, and I would have to think that would necessitate nothing other than the robust kind of enforcement of the existing laws on the books. I wouldn't think they would need any introduction of new powers really to do any of what you've just suggested. I think also what I would like to see in the long term would be the government to get out of the business of pronouncing its opinion on the rightness or wrongness of any other political group. So although Suella Braverman, it was a good thing in the sense that she designated these marches as hate marches, or was pointing out what was clearly there in the light of day when everyone else was ignoring it. So in a sense, she was someone who was just, pointing out that the emperor had no clothes. At the same time, given that she was the Home Secretary, it's not something that really the Home Secretary should be doing. It should be up to, public commentators, let's say in newspapers, to go and say this kind of thing, to provide that judgment, since she wields, especially as the Home Secretary, an immense amount of power, not just in the legislation she can pass, but also by the weight of her word. It's not something that she should actually be doing. And it's something that I'd like the government to stop doing in the long run. And okie doke. So we're in the last few minutes. Any final thoughts about any of the things we've spoken about, guys?
I do have one final thought. I mentioned the learning Hydra in one of my comments, and I mentioned that evasion of the problem will make the monster have more heads. But I didn't comment on what the routes to eradicate that hypothetical monster would be, and that is tackling the source of the issue. And the source of the issue of people supporting the acts of October 7th is not that they are on the streets chanting and supporting it. The source of the issue is, one, the weakness of the West to defend and support its ideas, and another associated issue is the notion of multiculturalism, which says that every single culture is the same and we shouldn't judge them. And if we want to eradicate that, challenge multiculturalism, challenge the notion that every culture is the same, and as well that cultures are based on ideas and on tribal associations, and that anyone can accept that culture, and that therefore any idea that it's held must be held and judged accordingly, independently of where you're coming from, and therefore either shun the people who hold really bad ideas or embrace the people who hold really good ideas.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Mark and Richard?
Well, Morgan, you said that the Home Office shouldn't make this kind of comments on Protestant stuff. You're right. But every single other politician who's not holding a specific post should actually have the moral standing to complain, to point out when somebody is being on the side of evil. And that would allow us to move forward in this debate quite a lot.
I can't tell the difference at the moment between a policeman, a politician, the king, when he's talking about Muslim values and British values in the same sentence, and everybody's being divided up into groups and also told they're all the same at the same time, while missing the essentials that do make them the same, and the essentials of being human and being pro-life, pro-individual. That's what I'd like to see. Less religious parties cropping up, or less religious groupings, and more pro-individual parties and less pro-state.
For sure. But okay, guys. So we'll wrap up the show. Thank you very much for joining me, everyone, and thanks for everyone watching. The reality show will be back tomorrow, along with the Daily Objective. Do we have anything coming on now at 7, Daniel?
And not today.
Not today. So everyone should just go and watch some of the other videos we've put up in the last week. But we'll see everyone tomorrow.